Good evening. It is Dan Kerr's DK Analytics. Thank you for tuning in. It's Wednesday, October 8th, 2020. The title of this video is All Roads Lead to Late Stage Rome. By the way, I don't think Cicero would have approved, but that's another story. Let me get to some brief valuation metrics. The US dollar, the Dixie, stood at 93.59. The Fed's balance sheet at $7.1 trillion. The US 10-year yielded 0.77%. The S&P 500 closed today at 34.46. Oil closed at 41.29 per blue barrel. Gold at $1,894 per troy ounce, and silver at $23.83 per troy ounce. The buck has reversed a bit of its downward trend. The Fed's balance sheet is starting to expand again, if only slowly for now. And precious metals, which entered a correction since early August, appear to be bottoming. Let me start with two quotes. And I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principles of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. Thomas Jefferson. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Benjamin Franklin. When dwelling on these quotes for a moment, the Jefferson one, think of global central banks printing trillions of fiat money to offset our global coronavirus policy response insanity and destructiveness, which, by the way, will have a long tail impact given the profound supply chain and small business destruction that has come out of our COVIDocracy as sustained by too many despotic coronacrats in power to this day. Think back to that old maxim, too many dollars chasing too few goods and services, or the real definition of inflation. By the way, inflation happens to be most pronounced, this is historically speaking, during periods of business suppression-induced economic decline offset by the printing press. Think back to the stagflationary 70s. In other words, stagflation is typically associated, high inflation, with low growth. That's why it's called stagflation. And hyperinflation is typically associated with an economic collapse in countries that have their own printing presses. So steeply negative real GDP and raging inflation. And when dwelling on Big Ben's wisdom on giving up essential liberty to obtain fleeting safety, never let real facts about the coronavirus dangers get in the way, including a recent CDC statistic that pointed to 99.8%, almost 100, of all coronavirus infected people from birth to 69 years of age survive, and 99.999% of all people after birth up to 19 years of age. And never mind that only 6% of the roughly 209,000 coronavirus attributed deaths in the US were solely or only due to the virus. This according also to the CDC. That is, there were no comorbidities such as cancer or heart disease or lung disease or diabetes on board. It was purely coronavirus attributed death or deaths. Note that patients with such chronic and serious illnesses can also, and do regularly, succumb to a flu or an influenza, which would be the straw that breaks the camel's or the patient's back and tragically ends his or her life. Said differently, roughly 12,500 people in the US have died where the coronavirus was the only cause mentioned. Note that some 47,000 people in the US, again according to the CDC, die from suicide annually. Right? What is that? 4 times as many as have died solely from the coronavirus? Yet, assuming people can venture out, people are still forced to wear masks nearly everywhere, despite masks' well-documented inability to stop a virus from spreading. I've gone over this once before. Call it year-round Halloween masks that give off hollow virtue signaling for fellow citizens. In other words, I'm protecting you. So I call them year-round Halloween masks that trigger hollow virtue signaling for fellow citizens, or are signs that the people are bowing to the all-knowing powers that be, from your local bureaucrat upwards. In fact, I'm involved with an effort here in Southwest Florida to free my daughter from this harmful masking tyranny, this insanity, and if events and clearances permit it, most especially if my daughter decides to go forward with this, I will turn that effort into a post that you may enjoy and even derive some inspiration from if your kids are also suffering physically, mentally, and or emotionally from all-day mask-wearing decrees in school. Right? That is, if your US-based schools ever reopened in the first place and you didn't have to quit your job to babysit or homeschool your kids, this while too many teachers and bureaucrats that make up the bulk of the US indoctrination establishment are getting full pay for sitting at home while checking their emails a few times a day. And you know what? In addition to hardly any young person succumbing to this virus, they are extremely poor transmitters as well, which makes wearing these useless masks doubly suspect at best. In a nutshell, bureaucrats and elected government employees continue to win while Main Street continues to wilt. Same goes for too many churches and synagogues, which have been told to effectively remain closed or to close back down in states such as California and New York. And if they don't, they face government-mandated shutdowns and even potential arrests. Meanwhile, rioting, vandalism, and theft can take place in blue states, protected by the First Amendment to the federal Constitution to peaceably assemble. Don't you know? You can't make this stuff up. With federal government benefits for virus policy impacted or triggered economic carnage having run out in the US, with election-related political battles keeping a new money printing extravaganza from giving the corona economy a new steroid injection, with new claims for unemployment insurance having picked up again until very recently, and with too much of small business America caught in the inhibiting coronavirus policy response debacle, an L-shaped recovery, no sustainable or organic recovery, in other words, is looking likelier than ever. This was also indicated by America's Q2 current account expansion to $171 billion from Q1's $111 billion. In the meantime, state and federal deficits and debt and unfunded pensions are exploding in the U.S. Consider, if you will, that the U.S. national debt has risen by a mind-bending $3.8 trillion since March of this year to over $27 trillion currently. And recall that it took about 180 years for the federal government to accumulate $2 trillion in debt. In a nutshell, as regards new federal government stimulus bill, crooked Nancy Pelosi wants the federal government to bail out blue states and their massively underfunded pension plans, and Trump won't sign off on it, at least so far. Hope dies last. Plus, the recent constitutionalist judge selection by Trump, Amy Barrett, to the Supreme Court of the United States is also creating new spending thrift gridlock, which would normally be a good thing. Meanwhile, the looting and rioting of anarchist, Marxist organizations such as BLM and Antifa continue. Yet, with U.S. stock and bond markets broadly remaining in blue sky valuation bubbles, while the coronacratic tyrants in population-rich states from California to Illinois to Michigan to New York to Pennsylvania continue to suffocate business and keep schools closed under the galling guise of protecting people from the virus. Once again, stocks and bonds are broadly disconnected from both economic and political reality, which doesn't preclude an even bigger bubble in the offing near term, especially if the market becomes convinced that President Trump will overcome the mail-in voter fraud and other Democratic plans to cheat in order to win. For extremely graphic flavor of where this can go, consider that in the city of Philadelphia in 2012, when Romney ran against Obama, not a single precinct tabulated a vote for Romney. I mentioned it before, but I think it's right to state it once more, just for extreme flavor of what could happen. Plus, the currently lacking additional fiscal policy largesse, or yet more deficit spending, thanks to the political calculus, it's being, as you know, put on ice. But because of this being put on ice, the Fed may actually come back onto the scene sooner than it otherwise would, with even more printing to save the day, because there's no fiscal policy intervention, more stimulus, more money printing to offset this debacle of policy that we have from Corona downward. And you know what? That very response by the Fed could well, and also ironically, elevate stock indices, leading stock indices, to even higher levels, and perhaps even bonds to even more insane valuation levels. And this is based on either normalized earnings power, solvency risks, or hugely manifesting inflation risks, namely printing untold amounts of money around the world as the economy shrinks and can't recover organically because of our policy insanity, as massively aggravated by the coronavirus response debacle. But such a Trump re-election anticipation, such a rally, would set the stage for an even greater stock market collapse and, ultimately, a bond market collapse, as economics always trump politics and even the printing press, time lag notwithstanding. And speaking of politics for just one more second or two, if neither candidate, Trump or Biden, managed to secure the requisite 270 electoral votes to be declared president. That's a bit more than half of the electoral votes, which are constituted, derived from 435 House representatives and 100 senators, right? So you get a bit more than half of that 535, and that's how you get the 270. It'd otherwise be 267.5. So they rounded it up to 270 electoral votes to be declared president. Well, if neither candidate gets to that level, 270 electoral votes, it will be each state legislature that is not only exclusively in charge of appointing electors in accordance with the number of senators and representatives, which I just said, to which each state is entitled in Congress, but those electors or representatives from each state will have one vote per state, right? So there'll be 50 votes. And this is regardless of the state's population, obviously. And that's what will, the votes that will be cast by each state if this isn't reached, the 270 electoral votes level, to determine who becomes or remains the next president of the United States. And by the way, no governor nor state level Supreme Court has any role to play here, even though some from Pennsylvania to Michigan are already trying to override the U.S. Constitution on federal election matters. In fact, Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution stipulates that solely the state legislatures have a say here, and they are the only ones that can determine the electors or representatives. Therefore, if Republican-held legislatures, which total 26 states to the Democrats' 22 states, have the balls, pardon my French, to stand their ground in the event of an electoral college result in which neither presidential candidate accumulates the requisite 270 votes to be considered the victor, then Trump will have darn good odds of being named president in such an occurrence. But don't tell crooked Nancy Pelosi about all that, for she is now positioning as leader of the House of Representatives to remove Trump from office using the 25th Amendment. That is, to remove a mentally or physically unfit president from office. That president is the same Donald Trump that made a few-day hospital pit stop to put down the coronavirus and is now swinging from the fences again. Once more, you can't make this stuff up, but it does point to what a clown show the U.S. government has become. Moreover, on the heels of yesterday's long overdue declassification of Hillary's approval of an effort to illegitimately target Trump with Russian collusion to distract from Hillary's own email scandal, which Obama knew about, we continue to hear crickets from the Republican side, which controlled the entire elected portion of the U.S. government for 2 years, and the presidency, obviously the Department of Justice, and the Senate for nearly 4 years. Talk about collusion. I call it bipartisan collusion, and it's a stinking shame. Ultimately, I continue to believe that the U.S. will be split in two, into socialist, Marxist, blue states, and into red states looking to revisit the Declaration of Independence and constitutional fidelity. That is, if sustained third world amnesty can be reined in, and if red states don't get turned blue by massive blue state immigration into them, which incoming blue state residents into red states, where they seek to avoid their blue states' high taxation and business unfriendly climates, but then once ensconced in red states, like locusts, vote Democratic once more. and threatened to flip them into the same quagmire they left. Suffice it to say, there is plenty of political uncertainty to add to huge economic, financial, and societal destruction risks to juxtapose against our incredibly pronounced stock and bond valuation bubbles. Those are my thoughts for the day on October 8th, 2020. As it's getting a bit dark, I apologize. I have been busy with all kinds of local issues and challenges, including bringing money into the house from various sources to address my own sustainability issues or difficulties. So my content frequency has been even more underwhelming than usual. I apologize without any guarantees. Suffice it to say that it's been a long and winding road for me from my erstwhile lofty perch as a thematic strategist at Credit Suisse's Zurich-based CIO office some 9 years ago to my current day job as a Southwest Florida produce delivery man for a Bonita Springs-based farmer. I can say this, however, I am closer to Main Street than ever, which hopefully will bring at least a few additional insights worthy of your consideration given what is at stake, also known as Main Street versus K Street, Wall Street, and the Fed, which is Wall Street. Hopefully, I won't get lost amongst the many, still somewhat confusing variations of lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, potatoes, and herbs that I need to deliver in very precise terms to picky buyers. Translation: hopefully I'll still be able to see the big picture forest and not get lost in the large selection of produce that I have to be on top of lest I risk purchasers' ire. I think it is fair to say that we live in interesting times as we travel further and further down that road to late stage Rome. I hope you got something out of this, perhaps just a smile or a frown, I don't know, but maybe it moved the needle a bit. That's my hope. Over and out, it's Dan. Bye-bye.